All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Gimel. We are in Miritzah Hashem picking up on Yud Beis Amud Beis. So the Gemara says, first of all, to thank our sponsors, to thank our TALMUD sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Meir and Rachel Gold for dedicating all the Shir and Rosh this month in memory of Yonah, Tzvi, Ben Yosef, Chaim, Elazar, HaKohen, Noam Leah Efron for dedicating all the Shir and Rosh this month in celebration of the 98th birthday of Noam's grandfather, Yosef Hershel ben Mordechai Halevi, and our week of learning sponsors, Mr. Esterson and Malka and Samuel Esterson in memory of Mrs. Miriam Goldfein, Miriam Bas Matitiyahu. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today. Incredible daf ahead of us today. All right. So we are picking up in Miritzah Hashem on the bottom of, let's actually pick up from Tanan Hassam. I know I left off with fenugreek. It's like leaving off on such a cliffhanger. What's going to happen with the Tilson? Okay, so we'll say it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say, remember again, yesterday we were focusing a lot, and now we're going to get into the fascinating sugya in terms of when the halachos regarding trumas and maestras is established. So remember again, we're working off the same basic model that we spoke about yesterday, which is we're operating on a 6-year tithing cycle. Years 1, 2, 4, and 5 are truma, meiser rishon, which are really always fixed, and meiser sheni. Years 3 and 6 are meiser ani. So remember again, the reason this is important is because, as we're going to see, there are certain items whose tithing year is established based on reaching a particular stage of maturation or growth, even though they may not be picked or harvested until later. That's why knowing this cycle is incredibly important. So let's go. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Tanan Hassam, we learned, Hatilson Misha Titzmach. So ultimately, again, fenugreek, it's tithing year, which will say, in other words, which year of the cycle it is subject to depends on when it sprouts. Now again, we'll define exactly what that means. Grain, olives, when they reach 1/3 of their growth, that establishes their tithing year. So we'll say, so again, just I know you know this, but just to illustrate this, so what that means is as follows. If you have grain that reached 1/3 maturity in year 2, but is not harvested until year 3, ultimately, that grain is subject to what? Meiser sheni and not meiser ani. Even though, again, it's being harvested in a meiser ani year, its meiser obligations are established by when it reaches 1/3 growth. So now we have tilson, we have zeisim and tevuah. So now I just want to point out, so far we have 3 categories. We have vegetables, right? When are vegetables? When is their tithing obligation determined? When? B'shas l'kitasa, when they're picked. Again, and we have a division, bundled or in the baskets, right? We have tevuah and zeisim, 1/3 maturity, and tilson, fenugreek, when it sprouts. We don't know what sprouts means. We'll say, my misha titzmach. What does it mean when it sprouts? Misha titzmach l'ziraim. So Rashi says over here, when you can see the fenugreek seeds inside of the plant, then it's considered to be mature. The Gemara says, how do you know that halacha l'maisa, that the tevuah and that the grain and the olives, when it reaches 1/3 maturity, ultimately it is subject, that determines its tithing obligations. From where do we know this? This is fascinating. The pasuk says as follows: Mikitz sheva shanim b'moed shnas hashmita bechag hasukos. So the Torah says as follows. This is in Dvarim, and the Torah here is describing hakel. So how does the Torah describe hakel? At the end of 7 years, b'moed shnas hashmita bechag hasukos. The end of 7 years, this is the sukkis after Shemitah, right? That's when you have hakel. Hakel takes place on the sukkis after Shemitah. Here's the problem. The Torah calls it after 7 years, sukkis after 7 years, but it calls it what? Shnas hashmita. But it's not Shnas Hashmita. What is it really? Year number 8. So the Gemara says, Shnas Hashmita ma'avidite, b'chag ha'sukos, shminis hi. By the time you get to Sukkis after the Shemitah year, that's no longer year 7, that's year 8. So why does the Torah call it year number 7? To teach us as follows: Kol Tavua she'eviya shlish b'shviyas l'pnei Rosh Hashana atanoig ba minag shviyas b'shminis. It comes to teach us a very important lesson, namely that any grain that has reached 1/3 maturity prior to Rosh Hashanah of year number 8 is given Shemitah status. So therefore, I will say, if you have grain, or that for that matter, olives, that has reached 1/3 maturity during the Shemitah year, even though you're not harvesting it until the following year, that produce has Shemitah sanctity and must be treated as such. Therefore, the Torah, when it's describing Hakel over here, talks about the idea that you have Sukkis, which is in year number 8, but calls it Shnas HaShemitah, because you could have, again, produce that is harvested during year number 8, that still has Shemitah sanctity. Look at Rashi. This is what the pasuk means to say. There is something that is harvested in year number 8, but yet that is aser, or I should say, not say aser, but ultimately, again, it has isurim like Shemitah. Good. So this seems to be the makar for this halacha of grain. So the Gemara says, have a beautiful mea shiloach to share with you on this Gemara, but we'll get a little bit weiter first. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Silber So Rabbi Silber said to Rabbi Asi, V'dilma lo ayil klal. So ultimately, how do you know that we're talking about grain that reached 1/3 maturity before Rosh Hashanah? Maybe we're talking about grain that didn't mature at all before Rosh Hashanah. In other words, maybe halacha l'maisa, only grain that was planted during Shemitah didn't mature, and still is unmatured, that halacha l'maisa, it's still going to have Shemitah sanctity. Look at Rashi. V'dilma lo ayil klal, afilo hischilu lizbashla b'shviyas ka'amar rachmana, mitzvahs shviyas limashech yisur al chag v'sukkos. Well, remember again, here's what the Gemara is suggesting until now. The Gemara is positing that grain that reached 1/3 maturity during the Shemitah year has Shemitah sanctity, even if it's not harvested till year number 8. Right? So the Gemara says, well, how do you know that? Maybe it's any grain that was planted during Shemitah, even if what? It didn't reach any level of maturity. In other words, maybe being planted during Shemitah maybe being planted during Shemitah is enough to endow you with Shemitah's sanctity, no matter how much maturity you did or did not gain over the course of the Shemitah year. And maybe what the Torah is actually telling me is like this. Listen, maybe the Torah is telling me that Shemitah actually extends until Sukkot of year number 8. Maybe that's what the Torah is saying. In other words, the Torah is telling me that anything you planted during the Shemitah year, or maybe even anything you planted until Sukkot of year number 8, is going to have Shemitah sanctity. Maybe that's the Torah saying. In other words, all the Gemara is asking is, I understand the concept. I understand what the pasuk is coming to convey to me is that there are elements of the Shemitah year that spill over into year number 8. And I understand, says the Gemara, you're trying to say that specifically applies to grain, which reached 1/3 maturity during the Shemitah year, that grain has Shemitah sanctity, even though it's not harvested until year number 8. All the Gemara is saying is, that's not, I don't know where you see that in the pasuk. I could just as easily make the argument to say anything planted during year number 7, Shemitah year, even if it didn't attain any significant maturity, has Shemitah sanctity. Furthermore, I could even say, maybe the Torah is telling me that certain dinim of Shemitah actually go until Sukkot of year number 8. To which the Gemara says, Lo sagadaytcha dichsiv v'chag ha'asif b'tseis hashana. The pasuk says, no, that's not true, because the Torah says, the Torah calls Sukkot, ultimately again, the Chag HaAsif, the Yom Tov of gathering, which we'll discuss, B'tseis Hashana, at the end of the year. So the Gemara says, my Asif. What does Asif mean? Ilema Chag Haba Bizman HaAsifa. If you want to say that the Torah is saying that ultimately Sukkot is the Yom Tov that comes at the time of the harvest, Haksiv Ba'asbicha. The Torah already says that. Right? Torah already used Lashon Ba'asbicha. Ella my asif katzir. Rather, what does asif mean? Asif means that ultimately, again, Sukkot is the time not only of gathering, but also it's still a time of harvest. V'kim luhu l'Rabbanon, and the rabbis know the Chol Tavua sheniktzira b'chag. So follow the drasha over here. What the Torah is saying is the fact that we call Sukkot Chag HaAsif. So again, on the most basic level, before you saw Rosh Hashanah Yud Gimel Lamed Aleph, how do you define why is it called Chag HaAsif? Why is it called Chag HaAsif? Because what was happening over the course of the summer? What was happening? You're leaving out the crops, or really the grain, to dry. So Chag HaAsif is when I bring all of the stuff into my silos, into my granary, into storage. The Torah says, here's the problem. The Torah already says that with the word ba'aspecha, when you will gather everything in. So Chag HaAsif must be coming to teach me something different. To which the Gemara says, Asif also means katsira, that there's certain harvesting that is still done, reaping that is still done on Sukkot. Now watch this. If you're harvesting or reaping wheat on Sukkot, there's one thing I know. My asif katsir, the kimlu rabbanon, the chol tvo sheniktzira b'chag, any wheat that's harvested on Sukkot, be'adua she'evia shlish lifnei Rosh Hashana. See, I will say, in order to harvest wheat on Sukkot, that wheat must have what? Reached at least 1/3 of its maturity, 1/3 of growth, prior to Rosh Hashanah of that same year. And yet, v'karilei b'tzeis Hashana. And it calls it Chag HaAsif at the conclusion of the year. So I will say, if you put all these pieces together, what it means is like this, that any grain you're harvesting during Sukkot, right, Chag HaAsif, b'tzeis Hashana, that grain belongs to the previous year, to Shemitah. Now, why does that grain belong to the previous year? Because if you're harvesting it during Sukkot, that by definition means what? It reached 1/3 maturity prior to Rosh Hashanah. So from here you see that when grain reaches 1/3 maturity, it's almost as if its grain identity is concretized and solidified, and at least for tithing purposes, that's when we determine the tithing obligation. But it's like quite an amazing drasha. So one more time, Chag HaAsif teaches, we understand in this context, Asif means Ketzira. Sukkot is a time you harvest wheat. If you're going to harvest wheat on Sukkot, Kimul the Rabbanon know that wheat must have reached 1/3 maturity prior to Rosh Hashanah, and the Torah says the identity of that wheat is Shemitah wheat. The fact that 1/3 maturity gives it Shemitah identity tells me that for tithing purposes as well, 1/3 maturity concretizes and solidifies its tithing obligations. Incredible. So it says the Gemara, Amar li Rabbi Yomi Rabbi Zera. So I'll say this is a great exchange. So Rabbi Yomi says, Rabbi Zera, Bekimluhu l'Rabbanon bein shlish l'pachos mishlish. Come on. The rabbis know the difference between wheat that reached 1/3 and a little bit less than 1/3. Come on, they really know. Look at Rashi for just a moment. They kimlu l'Rabbanan b'tmiya v'chi b'kiyan hein b'tiv gidul hatvua ladas she'ina tvua ru'uya liktzar b'chag ela imkein eviyah shlish b'shana sha'abra. So what we're going to see, what Rabbi Yirmiyah was really asking Rabbi Zera is, this is such a precise 1/3 of maturity. Are Chazal really able to make shiurim like this that are so precise? Amrle, Lav Amina Lacha. So Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, have I not told you before? Lo Safik Nafshecha Lebar Mehilchasa. So we'll say literally what this means is, do not remove yourself from halacha. What that means, Rashi says, Lo Safik Nafshecha Bar Mehilchasa Lefakfek B'shir Chachamim. How many times have I told you? Right? How many times? So Rabbi Zera says to Rabbi Yirmiyah, how many times have I told you? Stop questioning the shiurim of Chazal. Stop questioning the shiurim. Now I will say, now what does this mean? So I will say, you see, here's what's interesting. What Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking Rabbi Zera is a good kasha. And it's kasha we all ask in different ways at different times, which is, see, so let me get this straight. If the wheat reaches exactly 1/3 maturity, then it's Shemitah wheat, right? A little bit less than 1/3 maturity, ultimately again, it's not Shemitah wheat. So are the shiurim of Chazal so precise? In other words, I will say, think about this just a moment. If you're looking for precision, right, or if you want to be able to measure precision, it would make even a little bit more sense to say that what? If you planted wheat and the wheat was in the ground X number of days, I could measure days. So Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying, how can Chazal make such precise shiurim? Could we really live up to such level of precision? So Rabbi Zera says, stop it. We've had this discussion before. And he says, Kol midos chachamim kenhu. I will say, all measurements always have that level of precision associated with it. Meaning what? For example, we'll say mikveh has to be 40 sa. 40 sa. And what happens if you're missing a little bit less than 40 sa? What happens? Mikveh is not kosher. Mikveh is not kosher. Ultimately, again, if you have food that is the volume of an egg, it could contract tumas ochlin. But if you have an egg that is missing a little piece the size of a sesame seed, ultimately it doesn't have tumas ochlin. Shlosha al shlosha metame medras. Right? If you have a piece of cloth that is 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths. Right, shlosha by shlosha. It's metame tumas medras, which is the tumah that happens when somebody whose tummy rests on something, supports their weight on something. Shlosha chaser neima achos inu metame medras. So we'll say if you have 3 by 3 less a thread. So we'll say it's not metame tumas medras. So ultimately, again, what was Rabbi Zera responding? We'll say, in the world of shiurim, you always have this line. And if you're on the other side of the line, you don't meet the criteria. That's in any legal system. There's got to be a line. Now, when you stand at that line, you could easily say to yourself, come on, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. So a mikvah that has 40 sa is kosher, but you're missing 1 droplet of water, it's puzzle. Right? Food that has the volume of a beitzah is metam. So I'll say that's how any legal system works. That's how any shear works. That there has to be that line of demarcation, right? That line, if you're on one side of the line, you're good. If you're on the other side of the line, you're not good. It's the same thing over here. Yes, if you reach the shlish of growth, 1/3 of maturation, ultimately, again, that solidifies in this case, your Shemitah identity. Less than a third, it doesn't. Hadra Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah went ahead and he later on said, Lav milsehi da'amri. The truth is, I take back. I retract that which I said. I retract that which I said. So the Gemara says, after all, because the friends of Rav Kahana asked of him the following kasha. He says, look at Rashi, by the way, Lav milsehi da'amri, shekshesi lomar, vikim luhu d'rabanon, bein shlish lepakos mishlish, so we'll say what Rabbi Yirmiyah was wondering about was, could it be that the rabbis have such a level of precision? He was questioning, could they have such precision? Rabbi Zera says, yes, all shiurim are based on this ability to have some level of precision. So Rabbi Yirmiyah then retracted. He said, yeah, you're right. I will say, it's an interesting thing about these retractions. It's happening just yesterday. Somebody sent me an email, and then I don't know, it's never happened to me before. I got a follow-up email saying, Ploni so-and-so would like to recall, I think that was the Lashon, recall the email that they sent. And I was like, okay, I thought, like, what was happening? So I was curious. I checked my trash. It was one of those emails that went in the trash. And that's why they wanted to retract it. But, so it was still there. It's not like such an incredible yisod, right? In other words, you could notify someone that you would like to take it back. That's very nice. You can notify all you want. You can't take it back. So it's incredible. But here's the difference. The difference is, I will say, when something is a machlokes l'shem shamayim, and people disagree, and it's understood that the disagreement is there to reach MS, hadyabe, you could take it back, because it wasn't about ego, and it wasn't about covet. It was in order to go ahead, lahagdil Torah ladir, to reach the MS. So people disagree, and even, by the way, we'll say, we don't appreciate it because we're just reading here on the page, but I would imagine this exchange was pretty stark, right? Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zera, Rabbi, come on, could it really be that the rabbis are so precise? And Rabbi Zera says, how many times have I told you? Stop it. Don't take your head out of halacha. Right? So it gets a little testy. And then Rabbi Yirmiyah says, you know what, I take it back. And that's okay. It actually works because it's a machlokes l'shem shamayim. But when we disagree, and when we argue, and when we're nasty, and when we say things that we shouldn't, and it's not l'shem shamayim, it's because of ego, it's because of covet, it's because then ultimately you could send as many retraction emails as you want. That email, those words still sit on the heart and in the soul of the recipient. An incredible yisod. So the Gemara goes weiter. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I made a mistake. Omer shekrivu yisal bichnisasan le'aretz mehechan ekrivu. Rabbi said, this is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Klal Yisrael comes into Eretz Yisrael. And they had to offer up the Karban HaOmer. So ultimately, again, where did they get the barley for the Omer? Where did the barley come from the Omer? So the Gemara says, Im Tomar, well, what's the big deal? In other words, what do you mean, where did the barley come from? There's plenty of barley in Eretz Yisrael. They come into the land, they're conquering the land, they find barley. Im Tomar, the Ayel Biyad Nachri. So if you want to say that they got the barley from a non-Jew, that's not going to work. Kitzirchem Amrachmana, velo Kitzir Nachri. Ultimately, again, it has to be your grain. It has to be your grain. The barley has to come from Jewish grain. It cannot come from non-Jewish grain. The Gemara says, well, first of all, how do you know they offered up the barley in year one? Well, maybe they didn't offer up the Omer year one when they came into Eretz Yisrael. So So I'll say the pasuk says that ultimately, again, says in Yoshua, on the day after Pesach, right, when they came into the land, on the day after Pesach, matzos v'kaloi b'etzem hayom hazeh. So the Torah is indicating that they eat from chadash, they eat from new wheat on the day after Pesach. The only way to eat from new wheat on the day after Pesach is how? Is if you offer up the Karban Omer. So it sounds like they offered up the Karban Omer. So the Gemara says, Machras ha-Pesach achol, they only eat from the grain after Pesach, me'ikara lo achol. Ultimately again, but beforehand, they did not go ahead and offer and eat from the chadash, eat from the new grain. So the Gemara says, "Da krivu omer v'hadar achli." So mehechan krivu. So from where, once again, where did they get the karban omer? Amar lahen, he said to them, "Kol shelo heviu shlish biyad nachri." Ultimately, it will say. So there's a very simple eitzah. You see, you can go ahead and fulfill the obligation of Kitzir Chem, having the barley come from Jewish grain, even if it was owned by a Gentile. How so? As long as the Jews took ownership over it when it was less than 1/3, when it had reached less than 1/3 of its maturity. So grain before reaching 1/3 of its maturity doesn't really have a complete identity of grain. So as long as it became Jewishly owned before 1/3 maturity, so by the time it's in Jewish possession, it reaches that 1/3 benchmark, that's called Kitzir Chem. Kol shelo haviu shlish biyad nachri. The Gemara says, V'dilma ayol v'lo kimlahu. So we'll say, but one second, that's presupposing. Rashi says, v'dilma ayol v'lo kimlahu. Maskana de most Rabbi Yirmiyah he v'satayt chalo kimlahu. Dilma ayol biyad nachri v'lo kimlahu. So we'll say, but how do you know? How do you know that people know how to be so precise to know how to measure what's 1/3 of the maturity of the grain? So the Gemara says, maybe they're wrong, and maybe in fact it was more than 1/3, and it turns out that they offered up Gentile grain as the Karban Omer. Ela kimluhu hachanami kimlu. Rabbi Yirmiyah says they know. In other words, you see from this episode that, again, whether it's farmers or it's rabbanim, people know how to gauge when the grain has reached 1/3 of its maturity. So it's just an interesting fact that the first Karban Omer offered up in Eretz Yisrael under Yoshua apparently relied on this Gemara, that Kol shelo haviu shlish, any grain that did not reach 1/3 of its maturity, does not have a concretized grain identity. So we've been speaking about that legabe Shemitah or legabe Meiser. But now we see another ramification of it for Omer purposes. They came into Eretz Yisrael, took ownership of barley that was less than 1/3 mature, reached the 1/3 threshold under Jewish ownership. That satisfies the obligation of Kitzir Chem, and for Rabbi Yirmiyah's purpose, it shows you that Kimluhu Rabbanon, that Chazal, in this case again it was Yoshua, knew how to gauge 1/3 maturity. So Rabbi Yirmiyah's whole premise of do Chazal really know how to be so specific in Shiurim? The answer is a resounding yes. V'dilma lo ayol klal. So the Gemara says, well, maybe at the end of the day, they didn't go ahead and bring the Karban Omer at all. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma lo ayol klal, aval heicha ayol riva." So the Gemara says, "Aval heicha ayol riva bein shlish lepachos mishlish lo kimlu." So we'll say the Gemara says as follows: maybe halacha lemaisa, you could tell the difference between something that's not mature at all. But maybe once something reached a certain level of maturity, like it reached a quarter, the ability to tell the difference between a quarter and a third, maybe they don't possess that ability. The nation crossed the Yarden on the 10th of the month. And I will say, if you want to say that the grain didn't grow at all, so maybe the Gemara is suggesting over here that maybe when Klal Yisrael comes in, they got grain that didn't even grow, didn't even start to grow yet, right? Didn't even start to grow yet. So that's when you could tell. You could tell the difference between something that hasn't grown yet and but something that has, let's say, begun to grow. Let's say it's reached some level of maturity. The ability to tell the difference between something that's 1/4 complete and 1/3 complete, you can't really do. So maybe when Klal Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael, the grain was just not mature at all. Maybe that's what was happening. To which the Gemara says it doesn't work, and I'll tell you why. Because ultimately, Klal Yisrael comes into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of Nisan. And if you want to say that halacha l'maisa, the grain did not mature at all, so maybe you want to say, see what's happening over here? We're trying to figure out how did Klal Yisrael offer up the Karban HaOmer year number 1 in Eretz Yisrael? For one simple reason, it's got to be Jewish barley. It's got to be Jewish barley. So to take barley that was grown in a Gentile field, that's not going to work. So we suggested that what happened? The grain, when they came in, the grain didn't yet reach 1/3 maturity. Klal Yisrael comes in, conquers. Now their grain reaches 1/3 maturity under Jewish ownership, satisfies K'tzir Chem. Whereas maybe not. Maybe when they came in, the grain was just planted a little bit beforehand. There was really nothing, a little bit of growth. And that's why you could say that now it's going to be considered to be Jewish grain. But maybe Chazal don't really know how to tell the difference between a quarter growth, a third growth, to which the Gemara says it's impossible. I'll tell you why. Klal Yisrael enters Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of Nisan. The Karban HaOmer is offered when? The 15th. Right, on the 16th, right? Ultimately, again, if at the end of the day, they came in on the 10th, and what? There was no grain, it didn't grow at all. In 5 days, you're going to go from zero, going to go from little growth to fully mature barley. That doesn't happen. Elamai, da'ayil riva o danki. So we'll say it must have been that it grew a little bit. It grew a quarter or it grew a sixth. In other words, there was some level of growth that was there. Akati, bichamishin yomi mi kamalya. So we'll say, now the Gemara says, by the way, you brought up a whole other issue. Even if you're right, that the grain reached 1/3 mature, it didn't reach 1/3 maturity by the time Klal Yisrael came in. So therefore, here's the timeline. Klal Yisrael comes into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of Nisan. They conquer barley fields, and the barley was less than 1/3 mature. Great. Barley identity is not yet concretized. It becomes Jewishly owned before barley identity is concretized, and now ultimately, again, by the time it reaches 1/3, it's under Jewish ownership. But we'll say, what stage of maturation of barley do you offer up for Karban HaOmer? Fully mature barley. Right? No one wants to deal with immature barley, right? So I'll say, so ultimately, again, you use fully mature barley. So the Gemara says, whoa, this is another kasha. How do you go from less than 1/3 maturity to fully grown barley in 5 days? We'll say, look how beautiful this is. Elamai islachal meimar. We'll say, this is truly beautiful. Eretz Tzvi ksiv. One of the descriptive terms for Eretz Yisrael is the Navi in Daniel calls Eretz Yisrael the land of the Tzvi, right? Eretz Tzvi. So we'll say, what does it mean? Tzvi is the hind or the deer. What is that? What does that mean? Rashi says so beautifully, Mat Tzvi kal beraglav mikol hachayos, right? The Tzvi, the deer or the hind, is the fastest or swiftest of all of the animals. Af Eretz Yisrael kala levashal peroseha mikol ha'aratzos. The produce of Eretz Yisrael matures faster than any other land. So the Gemara Sachim Mefarshim Meseches Ksuvis. So the Gemara Samai Isdach Alameimar Eretz Tzvi Ksivba. You're right. It doesn't make any sense if you're learning this in Galus, right? It doesn't make any sense if you're thinking about this based on the agricultural reality of every other land. But Eretz Yisrael is called Eretz Tzvi. Eretz Yisrael is called the land of the hind. Right? The produce matures faster in Eretz Yisrael. Hachanami Eretz Tzvi Kesivba. So we'll say, isn't this absolutely beautiful? So how was Klal Yisrael able to enter in on the 10th of Nisan, get immature barley, right? Less than 1/3 growth, and 5 days later it's fully complete? That is the bracha of Eretz Yisrael. And I both say, you know, it's incredibly beautiful. If you think about this, even contemporarily, look at what has been accomplished in the state of Israel, in Medinas Yisrael, in Eretz Yisrael. Look at what has been accomplished in under 8 decades. Right? Look at what's been accomplished. It's mamish in Eretz Tzvi. It's in Eretz Tzvi. Everything in Eretz Yisrael has an accelerated pace, which also helps to explain driving and traffic patterns. Right? It's incredible, by the way. It's actually based on Daniel. It's not anyone's fault. This is part of the land. But all kidding aside, that's the gadlus of Eretz Yisrael. Everything happens in an accelerated pace. And I'll tell you what else this fits into. You know, for Bayis Shlishi, there's a machlokes about what's going to happen by the third Beis HaMikdash. Do we build it, or does it come down whole? So I always thought about this, like, why does it have to come down whole? We could build it, we're capable. Elamai, it could very well be that that's part of the Eretz Tzvi identity as well. That in Eretz Yisrael, things happen in an accelerated pace. Everything happens. The normal rules of like taking time and change takes time, all of those things, they don't apply in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael has a different fabric. It's just made up of something dramatically different. It's such an incredible idea. So that's how they were able to take barley that only reached 1/3 maturity upon entering on the 10th of Nisan, and by the 15th of Nisan, it was fully matured. Incredible, I'll say. Incredible. And by the way, what is chus? It is also to read this Gemara about Eretz Yisrael. When we see the news that came out of Eretz Yisrael yesterday, Meir Hashem, such wonderful news. November 1st, I don't know if it's been approved yet, but it's close enough. It's the best thing about getting news from Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't have to be real. Just that somebody have to heard it from someone else who said it, but it's good enough. Halavai, November 1st, Meir Hashem, the borders open again, and in Meir Hashem, we could go home. So the Gemara says as follows, Maskif Rabbi Chanina. So Rabbi Chanina raised the kasha. Rabbi Chanina says, now 1 second. So both say, so now we've successfully proven that 1/3 growth is considered to be maturation. So at least for Shemitah, at least for what we'll call tithing identity purposes. So Maskil Rabbi Chanina, Umi Matzis Amris Tahai Osif Kitzirhu. So both remember again, this whole thing is predicated on what? This whole thing is predicated on when the Torah calls Sukkis Chag HaOsif. Asif means what? Ktsira. Right? It means harvesting. Because aspecha means gathering. Asif means ktsira. So the Gemara says, really? We use Chag Asif for something else. So the Gemara says, V'haksiv v'aspecha bigarncha mikvecha v'amar mar. So we'll say, we said, the pasuk says about Sukkis, when you gather nigarncha from your threshing floor and from your wine press, v'amar mar, b'psoles goren v'yakev akasav medaber. The Torah is teaching us about the leftover stuff in the wine press and in the threshing floor. And Abba is telling you that what? That Allah Lamaisa, you can make schach from the leftover stuff in your threshing floor and your wine press. The Gemara says, so therefore again, Chag HaOsif is not, therefore Chag HaOsif teaches me about what I can go ahead and utilize for schach. The stuff that I gather in, the stuff that's left over after I gather in my produce, that's what I'm allowed to use for schach. So Chag HaOsif teaches me a din in schach. If that's the case, Chag HaOsif doesn't mean Ketzira. So I'll say this is great. Rabbi Silber says, you know, we had this all squared away. We were so happy, right? We had this whole sugya figured out. V'asar Rabbi Chanina shada beinarga, and Rabbi Zera just brought in. And Rabbi Chanina just brought an axe down on our entire limud. So you don't usually see lashon like this, right? They find like it's almost like you see Rabbi Zera saying, we were so excited. We had the whole thing figured out. We were even tied it back to Sefer Yoshua, and now comes along Rabbi Chanina, and he shattered everything. Ella, Minal. So back to the drawing board. So where do we know that wheat, when it achieves 1/3 maturity, that solidifies its wheat identity? Both Legabe Shemitah as well as Meiser. Kedesanya. Rabbi Yonah ben Yosef Omer. Rabbi Yonah ben Yosef says as follows: Va'asisa satvua l'shon shavosai. Isn't this incredible? Shemitah. Pasuk on Shemitah. V'asisa satvua l'shalosh shanim. So there's a bracha that in year number 6, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will give you a bounty for 3 years. V'asisa satvua l'shalosh shanim. I'll give you enough grain for 3 years. So I'm in base. Al tikri l'shalosh ella l'shlish. Very interesting. Don't read it l'shalosh for 3, but l'shlish. When does the tvua, when does the grain become grain? When is its identity solidified and concretized? When? when it reaches a third of its growth maturation. Gemara says, really? V'hami b'alei legufei. But ultimately, again, that pasuk teaches me a very important lesson, namely what? Manochal b'shana hashvius. Right? We say, Klal Yisrael says, what are we going to eat in year number 7? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Vitzivisi es birchasi. Right? I'm going to send you my blessing, and you'll have enough grain in year number 6 for years 6, 7, and 8. So I need that pasuk. You can't take away that shlosha, that right, or I should say l'shalosh. I need that shalosh to teach me the ikr concept. And now you're hijacking it to go ahead and teach me shlish. You can't do that. So the Gemara says, no. Ksiv krachrina. There's another pasuk. What does the pasuk say? Uzratem es hashana hashminis va'achaltem min hatvua yashon ad shana hatishiyas. So we'll say, listen to this. The pasuk Torah says, you shall plant grain. You shall plant your grain in the 8th year. Now listen to this pasuk. You'll plant in the 8th year, va'achaltem min hatvua yashon, and you'll eat from the old grain until the 9th year. So we'll say, now what does that tell you? What's the old grain? Year number 6 grain. Because remember, again, there's no new grain shemitah. I mean, there could be stuff that grows on its own. But Lamaisa, the fact that the Torah says, you'll plant the field again in year number 8, and you'll eat from the old grain, yashan, until year number 9. The old grain is year number 6 grain. What does that teach me? That teaches that in year number 6, we are given a triple bounty to sustain us for 6, 7, and 8. As such, because I learned it from this pasuk, ultimately again, l'shalosh ultimately is now open for a drasha, and we can darshan ultimately l'shalosh to mean what? L'shlish. And the way that we tap that pasuk is vasisa satvua l'shlish. When is grain considered to be? When is its grain identity solidified and concretized? Lishlish, when it gets to a third. Beautiful, I will say. Let's go back. So I'll say that closes out that sugya. So we know a couple of things. We now know vegetables, because let's go through our meiser list. Right? Vegetables, their identity is solidified when? B'shas lakita, when they're harvested. Okay, again, like I said before, whether put in the basket, bundled, we'll leave that on the side for now. Harvested. We now have tvua and zaysim, their identity is solidified when? When they reach 1/3 of their maturity. Where do we get that from? Let's just go with the last drasha. Pasuk by Shemitah, Vasisa Satvua Lishlish. We move on. Tanan Hasam. Ha'orez va'dochen va'pargin va'shumshimin. So it says this. Orez is rice. Dochan is millet. Pargin are poppy seeds. Shumshimin are sesame seeds. So all of these items, Sheshrishu lifnei Rosh Hashana misasrun sha'avar. These items are both said their identity is solidified as of when? Hashrasha, when they take root. So when they take root determines their Shemitah identity, their tithing identity. Therefore, again, if you plant these items before Rosh Hashanah, let's say before Rosh Hashanah of a Shemitah year, misasrun l'sha'avar umutarin b'shvius. Therefore, again, they would be counted, right? They would be tithed according to the schedule of year number 6. Remember again, what do you have in year number 6? You have Truma, Meiser Rishon, Meiser Ani. So they would be treated according to year number 6, and ultimately permitted for whatever you want, for commerce, for whatever you want during the Shemitah year. Ve'im lav, but if you did not plant these items before Rosh Hashanah of the Shemitah year, and you planted it afterwards, then ultimately, again, Asurim b'Shvius, it'll be Asur on Shemitah, Asur Shana Haba. And again, if it's not a Shemitah year, again, its tithing cycle will be determined by the following year. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, we see that these are now a third category of items whose identity is determined by when they take root. Amar Rabba. So Rabba said as follows, Amar Rabbanon, so we'll say, listen to this. This is great. This is a line to be underlined. Amar Rabbanon. The Rabbanon said, because we'll say, here is a good summation, summary. Ilan basar chanata. Now we have not gotten to this yet. We have not learned about fruit trees yet. We'll get to that in Mir Hashem. So Ilan, when it comes to trees, right, the tithing identity of trees, or really better stated, of fruits of the trees, is chanata, blossoming. What that means to be determined. Tvua v'zeisim basar shlish. Tvua and zeisim, their tithing identity is determined what or when? When they reach 1/3 of their maturity. And yerek vegetables basar lakita. Good. We've learned that all before. Hani Kaman, here's the problem. These items you just mentioned, rice and millet and poppy and sesame, where do you get this thing about taking root? In other words, we'll say they don't seem to fit into any of these categories. We assume everything kind of fits into one of these three established categories. Either you're a vegetable, right? You're a fruit, or you're a grain. And yet all these items just mentioned, at the end of the day, their tithing identity is determined by when they take root. So what category is that? So we'll say this is fascinating. Amar Rabba, mitoch she'asuyin prachin, azli rabbanon basar hashrasha. Here's what's interesting about these items. These are all items. You'll say generally, the items mentioned before, vegetables, fruit, tevua, olives, are all harvested at once. The common denominator of all of these items, the orez, the doch, and the pargim, the shumshimin, is that they are harvested, the Gemara says, prachin. They are not harvested at once. They're harvested a little bit at a time. Rashi says, mitoch shasuyin prachin, mitoch shegaronan asui ma'at ma'at, she'en niklotin ke'echad, ela hayom lotin mefarchin ma'at, ulamachar ma'at, nimtzu chadush. You're supposed to listen to this. So the problem is, because these items are harvested at different times, so you would be tempted to go ahead and say at the time of harvesting. But you can't do that because they don't have one harvest date. Therefore, again, azli rabbanan basar hashrasha. So because they don't have one harvest date, the rabbis decided when establishing their tithing identity, we always want to make the tithing identity for any group the same. Right? You don't want to have some rice has this identity, some rice has that identity. Well, because rice is harvested at different times, you could run into that. Therefore, hashrasha, right, taking root, is the great equalizer. It's the great equalizer. It applies to all of them the same. Go back to that Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Ela hayom lo k'tenu mefarchim ma'at, u'lemachar ma'at, v'nimtzu chadash v'yashem me'urav yachad, hanefrach le'pnim rashana v'nachal la'achar rashana, im holchen b'hen achar l'kita k'shar yarek, k'shiyehei mafresh masrosav. So we'll say the problem is, if you go basar l'kita, right? Like, because the Gemara assumes that really we should put this, ideally, in the vegetable category. And we should have, the tithing obligation should be established ultimately when you harvest it. The problem is, you're going to end up having things from different years put together. And remember again, the halachos of Meiser 101 is what? You can't take min ha'chadash ala yashan or min ha'yashan ala chadash. So therefore, again, we create an equalizer. They all take root. Apparently, everything's planted at the same time, and therefore the assumption is everything takes root at the same time as well. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, so what do? The yitzpor grono l'socho, v'nimtza torah min ha'chadash shebo ala chadash shebo, min ha'yashan shebo ala yashan shebo. So interestingly enough, Abaye says, well, I'll give you an eitzah. What should you do? In other words, even if for argument's sake, halacha l'maisa, you went ahead and you didn't go basar hashrasha, but you went basar l'kita. So what are you concerned about? If you go basar l'kita, that means for argument's sake, you could have some items that are from year one, some rice that's year one rice, some rice that's year two rice, and you're concerned because then you're going to end up going ahead and taking min ha'chadash ala yashan, yashan ala chadash. Abai says, I'll give you an eitzah. Take all of the rice after it's all been harvested. Put it in one pile. Put it on one pile. And then what? Just go ahead and tithe it like that. And when you do that, you could assume that you're tithing the chadash on the chadash and the yashan on the yashan. After all, Milo Tanya, did we not learn? Rabbi Yossi ben Kipar Amar, Mishum Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, Pula Mitzri. Pula Mitzri is this Egyptian lentil. Shezaro, Lezera, and you went ahead and you planted it in order to get its seeds. Miktsaso Hishrush Lefnei Rosh Hashana, or Miktsaso Hishrush Achar Rosh Hashana. And I will say, a situation you have is part of it took root before Rosh Hashana, part of it took root after Rosh Hashana. Ein Tarmin Uma'asrin Mizeh Al Zeh. You cannot tithe one part of this crop from another part of the crop. Why not? Lefi Shein Tarmin Uma'asrin Lo Min HaChadash Al Yash V'Lo Min HaYashan Al HaChadash. Because we'll see, you're not allowed to do that. That's Meiser 101. So Keitzaruo says, so what should you do? Listen to this. Sover Gerono L'Socho. Make a big pile of Pula Mitzri, pile everything together, and tithe it like that. Now, why are you allowed to do that? The Gemara says, Nimtza Torem Uma'asa Min HaChadash Shebo Al HaChadash Shebo Umin HaYashan Shebo Al HaYashan Shebo. So we'll say we allow that. Why? Because we know that in that pile is both Chadash and Yashan. But we assume that whatever you separate out will be representative of both groups. There'll be some Chadash and there'll be some Yashan. The Chadash will be the tithing obligation on the Chadash, and the Yashan will be the Yashan obligation on the Yashan. And that's okay. that works, says the Gemara. So as such again, you don't have to be backed into Hashrasha. Even if you want to go Basar Lakita, there is still a way to remedy this situation. Amrlei Arbas, you know what? We'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up in Mirat Hashem again. So what's exciting about this is we have some major categories. We have Ilan Basar Chanata, even though we did not learn that yet. We have Tavua and Zaysim, Basar Shlish, 1/3 maturity, and we have vegetables, Basar Lakita. This other grouping over here of the rice, the millet, the poppy, and the sesame, those are going Basar Hashrasha. We'll close out that category. B'Shah Tov Mitzlachas tomorrow. We'll say Shkoyach. Have a good Shah. Nice to see you.